Hi guys, our good friend Jacob Rees Mogg, the Right Honourable Gentleman from the 19th century, was back in studios doing interviews. This time it was with Brexit-friendly GB News, and he spoke to comedian commentator Mark Dolan about Brexit. So as we know, Rishi Sunak's government, following the economic disaster he inherited from Liz Truss's government, seems willing to build bridges with the EU, bridges that Boris Johnson's government was busy burning down. Jacob was pushed on some sort of benefits of Brexit, and what he said was, well, pretty pathetic. Have a listen to this.
Welcome to the studio.
Oh, thank you for having me.
They say that there's an agreement, a deal in the offing with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol. What might that deal look like? When will it happen? And will it be satisfactory?
Well, those are very good questions. The key is that the European Court of Justice is not involved in deciding what goes on in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It is no longer an outpost of the European Empire, and therefore it would be quite wrong.
Okay, we're off to a good start. An outpost of the European Empire, literally from a guy who probably lived through the British Empire and is pro-imperialistic by some of the things he's been saying about the British Empire, of course. Now, he's talking here about the European Court of Justice, which, of course, the UK signed up to as part of the withdrawal agreement. And the European Court of Justice is only concerned with EU law. So if there are aspects of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that are not affected by EU law, then it's not the business of the European Court of Justice. The UK government know this. Jacob Rees Mogg knows this. But he's trying to confuse people.
For it to continue to be subject to control by the European Court of Justice, that is fundamental. It is part of the United Kingdom, and therefore the flow of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland should be free. And there is
some goods will be free. Because if there are goods that are destined for the European Union, for example, for the Republic of Ireland, then they have to be checked. But in order to find out whether the goods are going to go into the Republic of Ireland, you need to check everything. Now, checks are one thing, but the real issue here is declarations. It's the paperwork. The paperwork is what's important, not so much the checks, because the European Commission has said that they're willing to eliminate most of the checks. Because if the system is good, if the system is reliable, if the UK is doing its side of the bargain, if it's upholding its side of the bargain, I should say, and everything is okay, then they can reduce the checks. They're more concerned about paperwork. So when people start talking about checks and goods, moving and the controls being carried out, it's a bit of a red herring. The real concern is the bureaucracy, is the paperwork. Once again, the European Commission have said that they're willing to eliminate up to 80% of the checks. That's because if the UK does what it's supposed to do, what it's signed up to do, then it won't be necessary to carry out so many checks.
There is a bill passing through Parliament that does that. So if there is no agreement, then that bill can complete its passage and we can do it anyway. We are, as you pointed out earlier, a sovereign nation.
Indeed, although given our current challenging economic circumstances, if we were to unilaterally remove, activate Article 16 and cancel the protocol, there would be a...
I hate having to repeat myself over this. Triggering Article 16 does not suspend the protocol. Triggering Article 16 suspends part of the protocol in order for the rest of the protocol to continue. Okay, it's a safety measure. It's to stop the protocol from being suspended. You suspend part of it for a limited amount of time. And, I've been talking about this before. It brings the two sides together. It initiates the joint committee. People have to meet. They have to talk about what the problem is, how to resolve it. And it's time limited as well. So it's not this thing that will bring down. Now, people will say, well, why was the EU so concerned about the UK willing to trigger Article 16? Because the EU is concerned that the UK would use Article 16 as a means to stop implementing the rest of the protocol. So they would be trying to break the protocol by using this mechanism that's designed not to break the protocol.
Trade war, and that would cost the country dearly, wouldn't it?
Well, we're the EU's biggest trading partner. We have a very large deficit with the European Union. So the cost to the European Union of not trading with the UK would be very significant too. Trade war.
I'm dumbfounded. We're still going back to use 2016, 2017, 2018 arguments. You know, they need us more than we need them. Really? Has this not been demonstrated to be false? Has it not already been demonstrated that businesses in the EU are moving away from doing trade with the UK? They're finding other markets. They're finding customers and traders, customers and suppliers within the EU. Really, what planet is this guy living on? Or what century is this guy living in?
Wars don't help anybody. I'm very against trade wars. I don't think we should indulge in one. If the EU decided to have one under the TCA, it has to be proportionate to the offence that they feel has taken place. They couldn't, under the agreement they've made, I mean, they could break their agreements, which they have in the past, but assume they stick to the agreement they made. They couldn't have a generalised trade war on changes to Northern Ireland.
But they wouldn't be doing a generalised trade war. And whatever the hell he means by a generalised trade war, the EU would impose tariffs on specific goods. They say, okay, you want to play hardball with us? We'll play hardball with you. We're going to put tariffs on certain goods that you want to export into the EU. It's going to make them much more expensive. It's much more difficult for your businesses to operate. It would target them. It wouldn't say we're going to put tariffs on everything, because they would harm businesses in the EU. But it could say, well, you know, there are areas that we could target, and we would target, because in a trade war, it's more a political thing than an economic thing, as he's correct in saying that there are no winners here. But picking a fight with your big neighbour is a mistake. They would come out much better. Yeah, no side wins here, but the EU would come out much better than the UK. You know, the UK imposed tariffs on itself, non-tariff barriers on itself, barriers to trade. The EU did not.
Do you think that the EU will budge on the ECJ?
Well, I think the ECJ has no right to interfere in the affairs of a sovereign nation that is not part of the European Union.
No, but they've been happy to do that hitherto, haven't they?
Of course they have. But that, I think, is a red line for politicians in Northern Ireland, and if we want the Northern Ireland Assembly to reconvene fully. But it should be a red line for British politicians. We can't allow...
But it's part of the withdrawal agreement. The thing that you have been defending. The thing that you stood up in Parliament back in, was it a couple of years ago, and said this is a wonderful deal. This was Boris Johnson's oven-ready deal, the withdrawal agreement. You championed it. You said it's wonderful, it's great, it's a victory. I know it's been trashed recently because of Northern Ireland, but you can't turn around now and say, you know, it's a red line. It wasn't a red line back in 2019.
Part of our country to remain under the suzerainty of the European Union.
Is it a red line for Rishi Sunak, do you think?
I would assume so. I mean, he's been pretty clear that he is committed to dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol properly.
What's your overview now about Brexit and how it's going?
Well, the fundamental thing is that we now determine our own government. And that is...
We determine our own government. This guy has been an MP since 2010. Imagine that. So while the UK was a member of the European Union, Jacob Rees Mogg was an MP. The UK is now outside the European Union, and Jacob Rees Mogg is still an MP. What has actually changed there?
It is so important. And then we can make choices. And we can make choices based on the democratic will of the British people. And I think that is fundamental to our future prosperity. And some of it's going to be in big things. So there is the potential of dealing with Solvency II, which could be worth, I think, £65 billion of extra investment a year. That's a really big thing. The Bank of England's dragging its feet, but leave that to one side. That's a big thing. But there are lots of little things that are happening. So we had a bill passing through Parliament, the House of Commons recently, on gene editing, which is going to be an improvement in agricultural processes for the UK that the EU won't have. We've got the retained EU law bill. There are 2,500, near enough, pieces of EU legislation that we will be able to change and have our own rules for. And that's a great opportunity to free up our markets, make the UK more efficient, and take the dead hand of costly regulation off business.
Okay. All right. So let's start off from the beginning here. He said about a financial, so something that's going to help the financial sector. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. I'm not an expert on that. I think I've heard it be mentioned before. If I'm correct, it's about insurance or something like that. But I'm not going to criticize that because I'm not familiar with it. Well, I'm not familiar enough with it. He also talked about gene editing. Now, when Jacob Rees-Mogg and others were selling Brexit, they were saying things like, it will help ordinary people. You'll be able to get a better job. You'll get better pay because there are fewer migrants. You won't have to queue for weeks or months for an NHS appointment. You won't have you won't have overcrowded classrooms because there'll be fewer foreigners. So there were all these benefits for ordinary people. And when they were selling Brexit, of course, they didn't talk about gene editing or banking changes or insurance changes. They talked about benefits for ordinary people. Where are these benefits now? Why is he talking about some obscure thing for the City of London? Why is he talking about gene editing? And finally, when it comes to the last thing he said here, regulations. So he wants to get rid of European regulations and introduce UK-only regulations. So let's just break this down for a moment. Imagine there's a pharmaceutical company. They produce medicine and they put it in bottles and they sell it to pharmacies. What Jacob Rees-Mogg is planning to do is to get rid of these regulations and introduce new ones. So I would love to ask him, can you describe some of these new regulations? So for example, what type of plastic can they use when they're using the packaging? Because at the moment there's a rule, because the UK was a member of the European Union, there was a European Union-wide rule there. So I don't know the specifics of medicines or pharmaceuticals, but let's say, for example, there is a specific law there for that. What about the chemicals that you can use within the medicines? What about the chemicals you're not allowed to use? What about the testing procedure for those medicines? You know, he wants to get rid of all of these things and introduce new ones. He's going to introduce new bureaucracy. This is not about getting rid of bureaucracy because you have to introduce new. So if people are used to doing it one way, you know, you have staff trained up to complete this bureaucracy, then you're going to have to introduce new staff or train the existing staff to know the new bureaucracy. And who's going to pay for that? Jacob Rees-Mogg and his government? I don't think so. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.